Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Natura Connect webinar. We're just giving a few moments for people to enter. So we've had a lot of registrations for this webinar, which we're very excited about. So welcome to this webinar. As a first note, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available publicly afterwards. So we assume by signing up to the webinar, you've agreed with this. As said, we'd like you to rename yourselves, if possible, in the questions posed in the chat, please, and indicate which speaker you are addressing them to. And we will invite you to open your camera when we open the discussion, but to save your bandwidth, you can keep it closed otherwise. We have an exciting agenda for you today. Myself, Evelyn, I will give you a welcome to the Natura Connect project. Then you will hear a presentation by my colleague, Oriane, on some learning materials that we're developing for the project. And we will include within that some Mentimeter questions for you to get an idea also of your interests and knowledge. So that link to log into Mentimeter will be shared with you, and I hope you've all used that app before. You need to do it on your phone, or I think you can do it by your browser. Excitingly, we have a presentation then from Italy about a public-private partnership initiative to fund protected area network and ecosystem services in Italy. Then, if time remains, I will give a short introduction to what might be coming in the next EU multi-annual financial framework, and then we have left enough time for questions and a discussion at the end of the webinar. So I myself am from the Institute for European Environmental Policy. We are a policy think tank based in Brussels. My colleague also working with me on biodiversity policy. We're hosting this webinar on behalf of the Natura Connect project, together with Europark Federation. So we're both partners in that project. And you see our contacts here. Feel free to reach out to us if what you hear has stimulated your interest. Now, to introduce the Natura Connect project to you briefly, this is a Horizon project. It's been running for 3 years now. And the real aim of it is to realize this promise in the EU biodiversity strategy to 2030 that there will be a coherent trans-European nature network using the abbreviation 10N, which sounds a bit awkward, but this essentially is not a new idea. It's an idea that we have this amazing networked protected areas in Europe driven by the EU legislation, the Natura 2000 network you're all familiar with, but we have a wide range of other protected areas, and I see many people representing protected areas here today. The idea is to bind these together into a ecologically coherent network, creating linkages which essentially include building ecological corridors. This is a concept that was previously known as green infrastructure. There's also green and blue veining, and there are ecological network strategies in many member states already. So what's Natura Connect doing about this? There are a lot of tools and maps that the project is producing, and these will be available. Some of them are already available to agencies, to protected area managers, and to member state governments to better plan and implement this network. One concrete product that's already available, for example, are these guidelines for connectivity, conservation and planning. Those are addressed at protected area managers and nature agencies. There's also work being done on favourable reference values, which is something that the nature directives already require, but it has become much more relevant now with the nature restoration regulation also. So within this project, we, as IEP, we have been involved in the work on the governance and the funding that will be needed, or that is already needed, to implement this. You will see that we, if you go to the Natura Connect website, that we've produced a series of fact sheets on funding and financing options for TenN. And what you will hear today is based on those fact sheets. What we are doing with those is turning them into learning materials, and this will be a learning platform hosted by the Europark Federation. And what you will hear today is part of those learning materials we're developing for the platform. So bear in mind that these are draft materials, and we really welcome your comments and your review if you're interested. So without further ado, I will pass over now to my colleague Oriane.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. Thank you all for joining today. So there are a range of financial costs that are associated with the extension of protected areas. We will break down these different costs and what they mean in practical terms. So when we talk about the costs of extended protected areas and ecological connectivity between them, we're looking at several key categories. We look at network planning costs, establishment cost, management costs, and communication cost. Throughout this brief presentation, we will take a closer look at each of these. Let's first unpack network planning costs. These are both one-time and ongoing expenses that are linked to creating or updating a well-connected network of protected areas. The capacity to plan and manage includes administrative costs, staff time, overheads, and training. Then the actual planning and mapping of areas, including habitat and species surveys, getting data on land cover and land use, land ownership, and other aspects. To make these plans a reality, we need specialized tools like GIS for mapping and IT infrastructure to support the data collection and analysis. It is also about sharing knowledge and collaborating with other regions, which often involves cross-border coordination, not only across borders, but also regions and administrations. Next up, we look at another key aspect, which is stakeholder engagement. This means organizing meetings with landowners and other key groups who may be affected by the expansion of protected areas or the creation of corridors or buffer zones. Plus, there is the ongoing monitoring and reporting to ensure the network is functioning as it should. All of this requires careful coordination and investment. Next, we look at protected area establishment costs. These are the one-time or recurring expenses that are tied to actually setting up protected areas. We are talking about costs associated with designating areas, deciding what level of protection they will have, and how they will connect with other parts of the network. This also includes administrative expenses like staffing, training, and coordination with teams, managing cross-border protected areas. And then there are the site designation costs, surveying the land, gathering species and habitat data, conducting impact assessments, and issuing permits. There are also physical costs like infrastructure development and landscape restoration. Next, we can look at compensation for private landowners, which is another cost to consider. This could include things like stewardship contracts with landowners, setting up alternative income generating activities, or short-term compensation for land use restrictions. Another approach is land purchases or land swaps to offer landowners an alternative outside the protection zone. Finally, addressing knowledge gaps is essential, which may involve conducting additional surveys or bringing in external experts. We also need to consider the potential ecological impacts under changing climate conditions, which may require further research and capacity building activities. Now let's have a look at management costs. These tend to be the most substantial over the long term. These are the ongoing day-to-day expenses associated with running a protected area. These costs include staff salaries, training, and administrative overheads. Plus, there is the coordination between teams, managing protected areas across borders, and managing the contracts with landowners. And of course, monitoring and reporting are essential to ensure that everything is on track. It is also very important to maintain the physical infrastructure, such as access, visitor centers, and visitor information. Some people can access and enjoy these areas safely. We then have compliance and enforcement, which are crucial aspects of protected areas. These costs include having staff, equipment, and data to monitor activities within and around the area. Next, please. Plus, there is the cost of assessing development projects that could impact the protected area and managing the permits and licenses for activities that take place. In addition, there are the costs associated with species and habitat restoration. This includes maintaining the tools and machineries needed for restoration efforts. Next, please. But it does not stop within the boundaries of the protected area. These costs extend to maintaining and restoring species and habitats outside of protected areas too, such as in corridors, buffer zones, and habitat patches. These are crucial to ensure connectivity between ecosystems. Lastly, let's talk about communication and awareness costs. These are all about raising awareness and educating the public, as well as sharing best practices among protected areas. It also includes the exchange of knowledge between land managers working on ecological corridors. Effective communication also ensures that everyone from local communities to international experts understand the importance of protecting our natural spaces. So to illustrate this cost, we have developed a case study on the Sognian Forest. We found this case study particularly interesting due to its governance challenges. To give some background, the Sognian Forest is a large, deciduous public forest that does include private properties. It spans across 4,383 hectares. It is located on the outskirts of Brussels and extended in Flanders and Wallonia in Belgium. The forest is a fragment of the original natural woodland of the region and includes areas that are recognized as old growth. The forest plays a very critical role ecologically, socially, and economically. And today, the management of the forest is focused on its ecological, landscape, and social functions, with a key emphasis on conservation and sustainable management. The Sognian Forest is designated as a protected forest under the laws of 3 of the Belgian regions, and parts of it are designated as nature reserves, World Heritage Sites, and as Natura 2000 sites. The Brussels region of the forest has been designated as a Natura 2000 site since 1996, and its designation protects 8 species and 11 habitats under the Habitats Directive. The Sognian Forest, as I mentioned, is designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and that has been happening since 2017. The management strategy for the Sognian Forest focuses on preserving forest soil landscapes, beech tree populations, while enhancing and building a more resilient ecosystem. Additionally, it aims to balance conservation with the forest recreational role, ensuring it remains a place for leisure for the more than 1 million people living around it. Next, please. When we have a look at the different costs that have been associated with the Sognian forest, the costs that require the most funding are the management costs, especially the internal costs. These are the ongoing day-to-day expenses associated with managing the forest. These are staff costs for forestry workers, rangers, watchers, and engineers. We also have external costs, and these external costs go to subcontractors for the maintenance of paths and tree cutting for security reasons. The Sognian forest, as I mentioned, is surrounded by peri-urban areas and fragmented by large highways. It is a strong leisure value, and it is used by people on foot, bike, and horseback. So managing the forest for its safety comes at a very high cost. There are also costs for maintaining forestry equipment, the cost of certification through the Forest Stewardship Council, and the UNESCO World Heritage Site. Network planning costs and establishment costs represent a very small portion of the budget, but the Sognian Forest is involved in the new Belgian National Park, known as the Braston Wouden. One aim of this new national park designation is to restore ecological connectivity between the Sognian forest and ancient beech and oak forests. There have been initiatives to connect the habitats of stag beetle in and around Brussels. For communication and awareness costs, there are quite a few campaigns. For example, the Respect in Forest campaign, which helps to ensure that visitors adopt some good but simple habits to protect the flora and fauna in the Sognian forest, and these habits were advertised through a series of flyers. Over time, there have been big investments made to restore natural ecosystems as well as to reconnect these fragmented areas. Next, please. A great example of such has been the development of green infrastructure, particularly the Ecoduct, which is a green bridge that was co-financed through a LIFE project that was led by the Flemish region from 2013. Since 2018, this bridge has allowed animals to cross over the highway and railway that cuts through the forest. The LIFE project has also financed eco-tunnels, underpasses, and eco-fences across the highway. Next, please. An intriguing aspect of the Sognian forest is that it spans across Belgium's 3 administrative regions. Naturally, this multi-level governance impacts the funding and management of the forest. Each region has its own staff and budget. However, they collaborate closely and unify their efforts through an interregional structural framework that was signed by the 3 regions. This framework really helps to maximize synergies and coordinate actions across the forest. On top of that, the Sognian Forest Foundation was established in 2019, which also plays a facilitating role. It supports the interregional work, especially when it comes to communication and managing touristic infrastructure. The foundation also helps access funding with fewer administrative barriers, whether that be through private philanthropy or applying for EU funding. And until now, the Sognian Forest has relied primarily on public funding. This is a model that will continue in the future. However, there is a growing need to diversify funding sources. So this is an overview of one of the case studies. We have much more information on this. This is just to give you a taster of what is coming in our finance module on the learning platform. We will now go into a Mentimeter for a bit more interaction and to get to know you a bit better.
Thank you very much, Oriane. And please note, this is the first part of the learning platform, so it's by no means all the material that we're producing. And it is designed at a sort of a mid-level audience, an audience who is getting to know funding possibilities. So not for very well-informed people, as I see there are many in the audience here today. So now you can see the Mentimeter code. We invite you to grab your phones and log into this, and you will begin to see the series of questions. What we would like to explore with you today really is the purpose of defining all this very awesome collection of things that need to be funded is in order to make sure that the EU funds really are delivering on these, and also that private funding opportunities are really developed and work in synergy. And the first step for this, of course, is to know what it is you need to fund and how. So it's a first Mentimeter question will be coming your way very soon. We are asking you to think about these costs in your own context. This is particularly, of course, stressed to those of you who are actually managing protected area networks. Which one's the most challenging to fund? And we can see immediately that ongoing management is the most pressing concern. One of the reasons might be that the network planning costs are managed generally at a much higher level. So these might be the national agency that's doing this, or a regional government. Another reason for the lower establishment costs is that many member states are not really establishing new protected areas now. However, there is an EU target to protect at least 30% of the land area, and member states have made pledges on this. So establishment is an EU concern. If anyone would like to make remarks about this breakdown, and particularly if you think that there's anything glaring that we've missed out from our categorization of costs, we would be very interested to hear that. Shall we move on to the next question? I don't see any more changes happening now. Thank you. Yes, so we would like to pick your brains on additional costs. And I think this is a free text window. So now please challenge us on the learning material you have just heard. One of the things that might come to your mind is compensation, for example, for large carnivore attacks, issues to do with land, private landowners, insurance cost. Is that insurance for the protected area managers, insurance for the infrastructure? Land leases, transaction costs. There are many different transaction costs. We're particularly interested in issues to do with land, exactly. Purchase of land, but there are also alternative ways to gain access to land, including land leases, land swaps, land banks, stewardship contracts. These all involve transaction costs. I can see transboundary networking now appearing. This is another issue we would like to highlight. But also the costs of salaries and payments for workers, tax compensation for, I think the bottom half of that got lost. But taxes are another tool that can be used to compensate for income foregone or for changes in restrictions on land use and so on. We have more entries coming in. I see that no one has mentioned invasive alien species here. Is anyone considering those a huge and growing cost, or in the overall some they might not be so significant. I think this word picture is very helpful because the more words here that are related to each other, the more we get an idea. Species translocation costs, thank you. That has been highlighted in the chat. The more we get an idea of what really comes up at the top in terms of concerns and needs. Perhaps also the costs that are most difficult to fund. Indeed, management of invasive alien species is wrapped up within the management costs. Okay, I think we move on to the next question. Thank you very much. That gives us a good idea. Training has just been added there. Thank you. Okay, thanks. Sorry, that was the set of questions. We'll have more questions for you in just a minute. So now Oriane is going to go through the work that we've done on the use of the EU funds as they stand currently. Bear in mind, this is the current set of regulations. They will stop applying in 2027, but are currently in force. Over to you, Oriane.
Thank you, Evelyn. So as mentioned, we have these fact sheets that go way more into detail about these. So I will just provide a brief overview. So now that we have covered the financial costs that are associated with protected areas and ecological connectivity, how are these funded? So it is critical to understand how both private and public funding opportunities can help us achieve the goal outlined in the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030, which is to develop this 10N. And understanding how to leverage diverse funding sources can help land managers designate and manage protected areas. According to the European Commission, at least 20 billion euro per year will be needed from both public, philanthropic, and private sources to achieve these targets. At present, availability of funding, as we all know, remains limited, and estimates suggest that only around 20% of the required EU funding, particularly for the Natura 2000 network, has been secured. When we look at public funding in European countries, national and regional public budgets are the primary source of funding for governance and management of protected areas. The level and availability of public funds vary significantly across countries, regions, and the types of protected areas. In several Eastern European countries, public budgets for protected area management are very limited. This leads to a strong reliance on EU funding. National parks, often managed at the national level, tend to be the most visible and well-resourced protected areas. These typically have dedicated administrative bodies and access to multiple income sources. In contrast, many regional or locally designated protected areas may lack dedicated funding streams and have limited administrative capacity within relevant authorities. Public funding provided by the EU are intended to support services and initiatives that benefit the wider community. These funds offer opportunities for transboundary cooperation, network planning, habitat restoration, and land acquisition. At the same time, the EU funds are aimed at multiple social and economic objectives. So nature conservation projects risk being sidelined if they do not also clearly deliver on these objectives. A major challenge within EU funding is the lack of finance once a project concludes, which threatens the long-term success of these initiatives. Private financing may provide an opportunity to expand and secure long-term support. Here are a couple of examples of EU public funds. Of course, there are other EU funds that are available. However, we chose these ones as we believe that they are the most relevant to TENN. To briefly go over them, we have the LIFE program, which is the EU's main funding tool for environmental and climate action. It directly supports TENN by funding the designation and management of Natura 2000 sites, increasing connectivity and blue and green infrastructure, including across borders. Interreg is a part of the EU cohesion policy and supports cross-border and regional cooperation. As biodiversity and ecosystems naturally cross regions and national borders, Interreg plays a key role in enhancing ecological connectivity across regions. It also encourages collaboration between different sectors, making it well suited to the complex nature of ecological connectivity work. The European Maritime Fisheries and Aquaculture, MFAF, it supports the Common Fisheries Policy and maritime sustainability. It helps designate new marine protected areas and supports connectivity through restoration of marine ecosystems. The CAP, which is the EU's main funding stream for agriculture and rural development, is vital for maintaining and restoring ecological corridors in farmlands and forests. It operates through tools such as eco schemes, agri-environment schemes, and non-productive investments. And lastly, we have ERDF and CF, which are part of the EU's cohesion policy, which aim to reduce regional disparities. And they support TENN through restoration and maintenance of natural habitats, awareness and sustainable use of protected areas. And these also fund projects that are related to climate adaptation, clean transport, all of which can help support TENN objectives. Next, we can have a quick overview of private financing. When we look at private financing within protected areas and ecological connectivity, this can come from individuals, businesses, or philanthropic organizations. These contributions may be profit-driven, aligned with corporate sustainability goals, or motivated by personal or philanthropic views. In Europe, private financing at the moment remains relatively small in conservation funding, but there seems to be more interest, specifically for companies looking to meet sustainability goals. Private finance does offer some opportunities to complement existing funding mechanisms by filling critical gaps, supporting ecosystem restoration, and contributing to long-term ecological planning. Instruments such as green bonds and biodiversity credits help broaden the range of ways the private sector can engage in conversation. We think it's very important to note that while private financing can provide meaningful and sustained support, the long-term success of protected areas and ecological networks will continue to depend strongly on public funding and policy support. And some examples, obviously this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some examples of private financing instruments that can be used. Some, for example, the user pay principle states that the users of natural resources should bear the costs of running down natural capital. And when we apply this to protected areas, this can be converted into entry payment fees or charges for overnight stays. We also have biodiversity credits, which, defined by the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, is a certificate that represents a measured and evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that is durable and additional to what would have otherwise occurred. And these are a market-based tool that serve as an incentive to restore and protect biodiversity by giving it a monetary value and making a tradable unit. Ecosystem services can also be a tool, and these ecosystem services can be quantified, allowing their benefits to be sold to interested buyers as a mean of funding a range of activities for land managers. Resilience bonds as well, which have much less examples, but a tool that can be used, which is a financial mechanism designed to decrease the risk of damage by extreme weather events and to make funds available to prepare for natural disasters. And we have green and blue bonds, which are investments that are made for environmental projects. Green bonds have been used for renewable energy in the past, and blue bonds have been made as investments for marine ecosystem restorations. And lastly, we have blended finance, which is a strategic approach that involves the use of public and/or philanthropic funds to change the risk or return profile of investment projects with the aim of attracting private investors. So this is to provide you a bit of an overview of these tools. As mentioned, our learning platform will give you much more details and examples of each of these. So please stay tuned for that.
Thank you very much, Ariane. We will now move on to the promised second set of questions, where we really appreciate your inputs. Please bear in mind that what Ariane presented was just a very short overview of the fact sheets that we have produced. So in the fact sheets, what we've tried to do is we've tried to highlight as many good examples as we could of how these funding and finance sources are being used and how they're being well used, but also emphasize the opportunities and the disadvantages of each funding source and the barriers to public funding. So what we would like to do now is to scope you collectively to see what funding sources are really dominant for you. And please here bear in mind that national and regional funding is usually the biggest pot of money, which we haven't mentioned, but which is also conspicuously lacking in some cases. And I think here we're interested in both what funds, where you have got the biggest amount of money, but also which ones have enabled you to be most effective. So Horizon Europe funding has come here. It's the EU research programme. That's one that we didn't look at. So that's interesting to see that come up. And I see that some national and other funds have come up, which are not familiar to me. But you'll see the acronyms here. And if you want to add more information in the chat, that might be useful for other people to understand what it is that you're referring to. The Next Generation EU programme, that's interesting. So some member states have really used this extra money from the EU in the Next Generation EU programme, the Recovery and Resilience Facility in particular, to increase spending for biodiversity. So it's good to see that here. Entrance charges, that's really interesting because most protected areas in the EU do assume that they provide a public good and therefore do not charge. But there are other ways of charging users in protected areas, which is part of this user pays principle analysis. Sorry, let me just have a quick check of the chat. We had another entry for Life and Interreg, 2 more entries for Life, so that would increase the size when people can use the Mentimeter. Yeah, so national co-financing has now appeared, but is quite small in the overall word cloud and state budget. So that to me does give the impression that really the EU funds are absolutely essential, and that these national and regional funds are actually not delivering. The best belt, I assume that means the funding program that's associated with the EU Green Belt, right? Correct me if I'm wrong there. So that's an initiative. Yeah, many thanks. So I can see comments appearing to reinforce the message that EU funding is essential, but also pointed out here, they work as a lever to generate more allocation of national funding. And of course, it's important to bear in mind that most EU funding requires a substantial co-financing from the member states. So if there's already a lack of opportunities at the national level, that is an additional barrier to accessing funding through the EU, through most of the EU funds, except for Life. Entrance fees, thank you. That's an example from Greece. Very useful to know. Brilliant, that's really useful. Should we pass on to the next question? So here we'd really like you to do an assessment, a quantitative assessment. So if you look at the amount of money that's flowing into your responsibility, which is the biggest pot that's paying in. And the national pot is really, really low here. Of course, this is always a question of the audience inputting here. So we're not collectively an accurate reflection of TEN management across the EU, but this is a very interesting balance. It's actually far more skewed towards the EU funds than I was expecting. I will just leave it a few more seconds in case anyone is inputting still to the Mentimeter. One more change just now, because this is very useful information for us also. Okay, I think that's it now. Thank you very much for those inputs. Is that the final question now? There's another one to come. Okay, right. So now we need to ask you about private financing. So we've already heard that Greece is using entrance fees, the user pays principle. Please tell us if you're using any other way to gain financing, including philanthropic spending. So this, by private financing, we do also include foundations. So there's a very big none in the middle of the screen. Is that going to be another added none? Okay. Well, we do count the Greece entrance fees here. It will be interesting to know from Elena what proportion of the overall budget the entrance fees are covering, if that information is available. So there's a sustainability credits example. That's very interesting. Payment for ecosystem services example. Corporate sustainable responsibility. So that's corporate funding, but without a for-profit aspect to it, I assume. Sponsorship, that's also from the private sector, but you can also have sponsorship from individuals. Trust arrangements. So we heard from the Sonium Forest that they've set up this foundation, which is a vehicle, the kind of vehicle that you need, governance vehicle, to enable you to do these things. So this is very, this is really helpful, and we really encourage you to look at the private financing fact sheets. And if you have any other examples of how you're trying to develop these instruments or have good experiences or bad experiences we would love to hear from you, because we would like to complement those fact sheets with additional examples. Okay, shall we move to the next question? Thank you very much. So we want to hear about your biggest challenges, and this is an issue that we have tried to address in the fact sheets, but of course they are, as the name says, they are short documents. We couldn't go into much detail, and this is something that we would like to be able to address in both in these learning materials and in further engagement work that we do under Natura Connect. So this is again a word cloud, I think. So this refers to both the use of the public funds, and of course we're particularly interested in barriers to the use of EU funding, but also the challenges if you have tried to mobilise private sector funding. And bear in mind that we're using a shortcut here by saying for protected areas, but we're always thinking here about the ecological connectivity that is needed. And here you need to think about your buffer zones or your ecological corridors between protected areas, which might not be themselves protected. There are different ways in which to secure the land use on those areas. Administrative burden, that comes up a lot, and bureaucracy is also another way of reflecting that. Yeah, the lowness of budgets overall. So if you have a low ongoing budget from your national funding, then you don't have the staff and the capacity to apply for EU funding or to manage the funding. The unpredictable changes that can include a lot, but does that include also political changes that affect protected areas, perhaps, or other changes? Greenwashing, that's an interesting one. I would be interested in seeing more detail on that. Consortium structure, that also could refer to the need to build consortia to apply for some EU funds, but also it could refer to governance, as we tried to point out in the Estonian example. Uncertainty relates to also unpredictability or unpredictable changes. So it's always a lot of this requires long-term planning, which requires a certain level of security and support. Inflation, good point. The partnership agreement, perhaps if that could be specified. There's a partnership agreement between member states and the EU on the use of EU funding, but there are many other types of partnership agreements that are the basis for protected area management. A comment on an experience with life funding. Overall low public priority of the allocation of funding. And of course that is also dependent on government and particularly the political direction of government at the higher level. Problems with interactions or lack of interactions with the local authority, because the local authority is often the key channel here, if I understand that correctly. It would be interesting to have more detail on that. Well, it depends on the protected area, of course. The category of protected area. Yeah. More general issues with the necessity to build partnerships and collaboration with other actors, because very few protected areas are in a position to do this. And particularly if there's a need for action at the network level, that has to happen at a higher level. So please do put in the comment if you disagree with any of the summaries I've made here. And is that the last question? That's the last question. So I think in the interests of time, I will now introduce our next speaker. We're very pleased to welcome Giulia Amato. She's here from the Lombardy region of Italy and in charge of the Nature Governance Programme. And she will introduce how they have set up a public-private fund partnership. Over to you, Giulia. Thank you.
Thank you all. And I'm really happy to be here, and good morning from my side as well. Yes, I'm here because I wanted to tell you a bit about this Bioclima initiative, which is a public-private partnership. So let's say that with this initiative, we tried in the last years to fill some of the gaps that might hide behind that big known that appeared about private financing in the previous Mentimeter slide. So we know that between public and private sectors, we don't always find alignment. So with this, let's say, test, we try to find some, and I'm eager to let you know how. But first, just a couple of words about my company. So I work in Etifor, and we, as general aim, we try to put nature at the heart of the decision making by developing science-based solutions. And in this sense, we are a specialized environmental consulting company, which helps both the private and the public sector, in my case, specifically the public sector, in improving their economic, environmental, and social benefits of policy projects and investments. In particular, what we do in our team is synthesized by these services, which, let's say, cover a wide range of topics from the governance of protected areas and the stakeholder engagement, nature-based solution development, the economic evaluation of ecosystem services, so trying to associate an economic and monetary value on the benefits that we receive from nature. And then there's the very important economic and fundraising part. So we both work with the public funds that we mentioned before with the EU project, but we also develop innovative financing and payment for ecosystem services. And it is inside this service that we were able in 2022 to develop the scheme that I'm going to talk to you about. So Etifor was kind of a facilitator of the process and intermediary also actor, as you will see. So the main actors that played important roles in these schemes are Lombardy region, in particular through the Natura che Vale project, which was the previous Life Gestire 2020 project, which aimed to preserve biodiversity and ecological connectivity in Lombardy region. And inside this, it enabled us to develop some innovative financing and experimentation. Then there's us, and also the Cariplo Foundation, which is a bank foundation, which made available more resources to work on the scheme. So basically, the goal that we wanted to achieve with this financial mechanism was, first of all, to fund the prioritized action framework for Natura 2000 sites in Lombardy region. So preserve biodiversity and conduct the activities and the conservation actions that were foreseen in the PAF. Then we wanted also to implement the regional biodiversity and sustainable development strategy. And we also wanted to involve the private sectors and the citizens in these nature restoration activities. So how did we do this? We find some key elements in the scheme. So first of all, Bioclima was a public grant of 3.5 million euro made available by Lombardy region to promote projects that would incentivize biodiversity conservation and forest climate adaptation measures. But it also aimed to leverage private finance for conservation. because the business model that was compulsory for applicants to apply for these grants were to let's say commit to ensure to measure ecosystem services impacts, for example using the FSC standard procedures, and also to have sponsors, private sponsors, committed to support ecosystem services. Then the third step of this scheme was also to have available a technical assistant to support Natura 2000 managers and regional parks who were the beneficiaries of the grant in identifying the right intervention, carry out the certification, and also finding the right sponsor. I know that probably all of you are already available, but just to be sure, the FSC standard, which is behind, let's say, this scheme, is the most globally trusted and recognized voluntary, independent, and third-party certification system for the responsible management in the world forest. But what's interesting in this scheme is that starting from 2018, FSC also launched its own procedure for the certification of ecosystem services. So with this certification, forest manager may not only demonstrate how well, let's say, how responsibly they are managing their forest, but also the positive impact that this kind of management has on several ecosystem services, in particular on biodiversity conservation, CO2 capture, watershed services, soil conservation, and tourism and recreational values. So using this standard, we also framed a bit better the scheme, which I'm going to show you right now. So basically, as I was mentioning, the basic part was this public fund made available by Lombard region of 3.5 million euro, whose beneficiaries were the Natura 2000 site managers. So this could be provinces, it could be regional parks, it could be municipalities, basically. So Natura 2000 sites are usually not managed by national or big parks. So this was a very important fund made available for this kind of managers, which usually don't access this kind of funds. So they had to commit to carry out, as mentioned, biodiversity-related projects. But as mentioned, the other part and compulsory part of the business model was that all of the project must also encompass a private sector commitment of co-financing the project. So we had 3.5 million from public funds and a target of 1.5 million of co-financing from the private sector. So before submitting the project, the beneficiaries needed to find out the sponsor for their own project. So the question, of course, for the private sector is why should they participate in this kind of scheme? And the idea, as mentioned, is that once carried out the project, we could do an independent third-party measurement of the impact on ecosystem services of the forest management, and so we could demonstrate the positive impact. And these positive impacts could then be used by the private sector for CSR purposes. So they could attribute to themselves the positive impact because they were, of course, financing these interventions. As mentioned, the alignment between the public and the private sector is not always easy, and it might also not be easy for the beneficiaries to find for private funding. And that's the reason why Cariplo Foundation, in parallel, also activated a technical assistance, which was carried out by ETIFO. It is, until today, carried out by ETIFO, which did mainly three things. The first one was giving technical support to the beneficiaries in order to understand the best intervention to be put in the project. The second and maybe most important part was securing the private co-finance part. So looking out for private sponsor and making sure they were committed to co-finance the project. And then we are also now supporting the verification of the ecosystem services in the project that passed. Very important remark when engaging with private sector and also our policy, let's say, on this. is that, of course, all the claims that are made are compliant with the FSC standard and what can be said and what cannot be said, because this is very strict, and it is very important that then later the private companies do not claim more than what they did. Of course, to avoid greenwashing and misleading consumers and other clients about their behavior. We also follow what it is called the mitigation hierarchy, which means basically that before committing to offsetting the impacts, that might be impacts on carbon, might be impacts on biodiversity, private companies should take the other steps before. So they need to avoid the impacts that they can avoid. They must minimize the impacts that they can minimize, and restore where the impact is done. And only after that they can commit to offsetting. And this, of course, help us to avoid, once again, greenwashing and working with companies who only wants to show without really doing without really having a positive impact on the environment. And then we also engage with citizens, employees, and local population through the portal, which is called wownature.eu, that enable them to adopt and sustain also as single citizens and local population the projects that were funded by the Bioclima. Some key results, because it's been some years now that the program is running. So out of the 30 regional entities that firstly were interested in participating in the scheme, in the end 12 regional parks obtained the public financing, and these are some of the positive impacts on the habitats and on the activities that we did. So 300 hectares of forest management improvement, some reforestation, habitat upgrade, of course, biodiversity enhanced with more plant species and animal species, and a lot of new certified areas under the FSC standard. As you can see here, 10 parks got certified very recently, because the other 2 were already certified. This is an overview of the project which are now running. And as you can see, they're spread all around the Lombardy region, which is displayed here, and cover also a wide variety of ecosystems. So we go from river, plain, and mountain ecosystems, also allowing different kinds of interventions. On the private side, instead, we until today signed contract for sponsorship worth 1.3 million euro. So we are not at the target of 1.5 million euro, but as you can understand, we're almost there. This encompassed 79 private companies with which we have now contracts for sustaining and co-financing the conservation project. So to draw some conclusions, as you can understand, this was a first attempt of having mixed finance at regional level in Italy. And honestly, it wasn't easy to set up, and it isn't easy to manage, but of course we learned a lot in the process, and we have reached also a lot of nice and positive impact. Now Lombardy region is also planning on launching a new phase involving more the financial sector as co-financer, which was not so involved until now. And of course, this represents in the area a great opportunity for Natura 2000 managers, because as mentioned, they couldn't access some of the other funds that were maybe available for national parks or other kind of protected areas. And we also saw that, let's say, our job, but it could be also other technical people, but the technical assistance is necessary to fill the gap between the 2 sectors, because they have private and public sectors have different timings, have different challenges, and also expect different outputs. So we need to align between them. And so the technical assistance, we saw it is really, really important. I will stop here, but I can just show you this slide with some QR codes where you can find more info. In particular, the general info page here has more more information. And of course, if you want to discover more about this scheme, you can find some more information here. So thanks a lot. And of course, if there are any questions, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giulia, for that really interesting presentation. So this is an example to really show how these financing processes can be put into practice, but also a mention of the challenges. So we've left a good time now for questions. So we would invite you to open your cameras and open your mics and raise your hand if you would like to ask Giulia a question directly on her case study. And we're also opening up for questions and remarks on what you heard previously as well. So either post your question in the chat or raise your hand, and we will start monitoring them now. So I see we have one interesting example that has just been posted in the chat for the Endurach project. That is more of a request for information, I understand. Okay, so there's a question here addressed to Giulia, I think. Could you explain something about the Caneto sul Oglio project?
Yes, I would like to, but unfortunately, I didn't follow that one specific project in particular, so I can't give you more information. But if you go on the website, you will find a web page for each of the projects. So you will for sure see more about the project. So I'm sorry I can't give you more details right now, but you will find, I think, more information. And of course, if you have more questions, you can reach out and I will ask the project manager in Equifor to give you more details. Absolutely.
Can you give a bit more information on how you use the mitigation hierarchy?
Yes. So again, on the Equifor website, I can send you a link. We displayed this, I think, very well. We used a method that we developed, which is called LUCES, which covers the different parts of the mitigation hierarchy. So basically, once we approach with the private companies, we ask them to commit to follow this plan, which basically goes through all the phases that I showed you before. So avoid and reduce, here we go, avoid, minimize, restore, and then offset. And for doing this, we refer to the international standard TFND. And we work together with the private companies to understand which are their impacts. We measure them, of course. And after having understood which are their impacts, we draw together a strategy for the avoidance, the minimization part, and then at the end we find let's say the offsetting project, which is in this case the Bioclima one. So I can send you the link in the chat so you can have more details on this as well. I will stop sharing so I can look for the link in the meantime.
René, feel free to open your mic if you have an additional question.
No, it was clear to me. So thank you for the information. If you can send the link, that's also a good start to work with.
Can we perhaps ask you, Giulia, to say a bit more about the main challenges that you faced?
Yes.
Thinking about the word cloud that we created before.
Yeah, yes. I would say the different expectations that the public and the private sector had. So the thing that I already mentioned before, because this was really a struggle to, let's say, convince on the one side the private sector to participate in this kind of projects without maybe seeing right away the benefit that they could get. So also because, you know, the certification takes some time, and the measurement of the impacts, of course, takes some time, and then the communication. So usually the private sector wants everything straight away, while of course nature has its own time. And the Natura 2000 managers know this very well. So getting the private sector committing to finance this kind of project was also difficult, also because they wanted to see a local project. So they are not so eager to finance very far away projects or in other ecosystem, etc. They are very interested in supporting local projects. So we needed to find the match between the regional park or the Natura 2000 site that wanted to commit to carry out the project, which because it's also a commitment. It's not you will have to carry out, of course, the work and to sustain the maintenance cost. This, so from the local side, from the regional park, finding the right match with the private sector also locally. So we couldn't, let's say, wonder about too much about finding the right sponsor. But this was very useful also for sustaining maintenance costs later. So the management costs of the project are now mainly sustained by the private funding. So while with the public funding, the public grant, we funded the implementation part, so the realization of the interventions. While with the private one, we are able now to carry out the maintenance and the management costs. So this is also useful for having both of the costs sustained on the long term, which is also an issue, as we know and we discussed before.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
I think you might have just answered Katerina Rakowska's question. Which part of the needed funding have you secured through the private funding?
Yeah.
But Katerina, please speak up if you would like to hear more.
Sorry, maybe I missed the percentage.
So we are now at 3.5 million of public and 1.3 million of private. So what it is, maybe 35 to 40%.
Thanks.
So it's I mean, quite an amount, in my opinion. It's not secondary. And that was the aim, of course, of the scheme.
Can I ask, in the last minute we have, would anyone like to raise a question or comment on the issues we addressed in the previous presentations? One thing we didn't address specifically, of course, are the use of nature credits or biodiversity credits, and there's a lot of debate going on this right now. And one of the issues that we struggle with is the additionality. So what should be expected of public authorities to fund, because these are legal requirements, and to what extent can private sector be used to fill those gaps? There's also the issues that Giulio has just raised about the uncertainty of nature projects, particularly long-term restoration projects, and the time that it takes to generate impacts where you can prove that you have achieved the benefits. Speak up now if you would like to raise a point. Okay, maybe on that point then I will move on to my last slides. And here I see we have some very well-informed people in the audience. So my first point will be to make my first point to make will be that there's a lot of uncertainty still about what the next EU financial framework will look like. What I'm saying here is based on some leaks, which I'm sure you've all seen. They're not particularly up to date. And on the news that I received. So it's a very partial picture. And I will appreciate corrections and comments from you in the QA session that follows this. But I would like to make some general remarks first. So first of all, how much overall funding will be available in the next funding period? And quickly, for those of you who are not familiar how EU funding works, it is programmed in 6-year periods. The funds themselves, which you're familiar with, are framed by regulations, but those regulations are tied to these 6-month periods. So the way that the funds work, the rules, the specificities can change in each period, which is why the next MFF is so important. What we know is that overall the MFF envelope is highly likely or almost certain to be smaller than it currently is for several reasons. There are new additional priorities that have been raised up the political spectrum, particularly defence, security, competitiveness, a greater focus on industrial investment. At the same time, we know that the costs associated with climate change, with disasters and crises are likely to increase rather than decrease. We also know that the Commission has to start repaying the loans that were taken out for that extra next generation funding. And most member states are unwilling currently to increase the allocations that they pay into the EU pot, particularly Germany, who is the biggest contributor, I believe. But it does mean that there needs to be a focus on making the available funding work better. And the amount of funding that is available overall, potentially for biodiversity, is still very significant. So the one thing we know is that the Commission, at the high level, I should say, when I say Commission here, I mean the top levels, they are pushing for a performance-based approach to the whole budget with milestones and targets. This is modelled on the approach that has already been used for the Recovery and Resilience Facility grants and loans. But they're also pushing for a quite radical restructuring of how the programs work. Now, it's obvious that there needs to be simplification and restructuring because the Commission is currently managing 52 separate funding programs. But the major change will be that, well, first of all, I'll explain there'll be 3 main pillars in this proposal. The first is the Competitiveness Fund, which is directly managed by the Commission. The second is a Global Europe Fund, which brings together all of the funds that go also to outside of the EU. And the third is a pillar that brings together the funds that are co-managed between the member states and the Commission. And this is known as the national envelope. So what this does is it builds on, but also really goes further than the partnership approach that was taken with the funds in the current period. Member states would have more flexibility to shift funds between these different funds, and this includes the really big ones. So the cohesion funds, the CAP, Rural Development Fund. It also includes part of the current LIFE programme, the nature and biodiversity part of the LIFE programme. Next slide, please. The focus on a more performance-based approach does mean that there are also opportunities to this, not just threats. So what Natura Connect has done is it's put in a submission to the consultation on the next MFF, public consultation to which everyone could submit, which is now closed. They're also issuing a scientist's letter right now for signature. I know that many of you are probably involved in other initiatives because I can see a number of NGO people on the list today. And this is the time to push good ideas because there's a great need for good ideas for how to better mainstream biodiversity in existing funding, how to really earmark biodiversity better, how to make spending deliver better for biodiversity. The first point that we made is that the LIFE, the Interreg, and also the other opportunities in the cohesion funds are really essential for the needs of protected area networks and creating ecological connectivity. You really emphasized this with your inputs to the Mentimeter before, but the specific points we made are that these, particularly LIFE and cohesion, the cohesion opportunities, give the opportunity to fund land purchase or other land arrangements, which are not eligible costs in many funds. They do also allow the capacity building in public authorities, which again is not always an eligible cost, and particularly this real importance of really catalysing and supporting cross-border action, as well, of course, as the targeted maintenance costs, the bigger restoration investments that we need to achieve our targets and restore the degraded habitats and species that we all know are such a problem. So we highlighted Interreg here, the particular role of Interreg projects, and there are many flagship Interreg projects that we could highlight here. But we also pointed to the other dimension of the cohesion funds. By this I mean the Regional Development Fund, the cohesion fund that goes primarily to Eastern European countries, but also the social fund, because there are big spends here on infrastructure, which could have a really much stronger potential to create biodiversity positive or nature positive outcomes, but are currently a cause for harm to biodiversity in some cases, increasing fragmentation, for example, destroying opportunities to create ecological connectivity. Then we've made a point that there really need to be better ways in which to earmark funds for biodiversity, so to make sure a certain part of a pot is dedicated to the objective, because of this issue of competing objectives. It's often, if you have a lack of capacity and administrative capacity, it's easier to fund large things made out of concrete than it is to fund difficult long-term biodiversity projects. But there's also, I know that there's still a lot of calls for a dedicated nature restoration fund in the next MFF. The political chances of this are shrinking, but I'd be interested to hear comments for that. Also, the risk that the current MFF-wide binding spending target we have on biodiversity is also at risk. We need good ideas for how to either make a clear division between spending on nature versus spending on climate and energy, or we need to maximize the synergies so that there's really a clear co-delivery for climate and nature at the same level. For climate adaptation spending, there also needs to be better ways in which to distinguish the climate adaptation spending that is creating positive impacts on nature and what is not, or is actually harmful. And the nature-based solutions approach is talked about a lot here. More widely, when you're looking at a more performance-based approach, you need to have measurable milestones and indicators. We all know that biodiversity is not the easiest thing to measure, but we now, a very key factor here is that we now have the Nature Restoration Regulation, which has set legally binding targets and reporting. And as Julia mentioned, we already have the prioritized action framework procedure that has to really quantify and specify the funding that is needed for the Natura network and for the green infrastructure, for the ecological connectivity and the protected species in the next MFF. And the use of this tool has improved, but it could be much stronger. One of the aspects is that it's something that's done by the Environment Ministry, and it is not necessarily paid attention to by other aspects of government. So there needs to be strengthening there. A last point that I would like to make is that the more you make funding results oriented and performance oriented, the more you need the real administrative capacity and technical support and the expertise at all governance levels to ensure that these funds are can be accessed and are being used effectively, and that you can gather all that information on to show the impact and the effectiveness, but also then to allow a certain adaptivity and flexibility. So this again goes back to the need for technical support and capacity, ensuring capacity at local government level, which is currently being eroded in many places, and the best possible biodiversity monitoring and data collection in a harmonized way. Last but not least, we need better safeguards and proofing of spending that is not focused on biodiversity, but it's potential to harm biodiversity. So I'm sure you've heard of the Do No Significant Harm principle that was established in the Recovery and Resilience Funds, but that hasn't yet been mainstreamed in the other EU funds. There are the established tools that are set by EU regulations, so the need to do an ex-ante assessment of impacts, including a strategic environmental assessment, and specifically for Natura 2000. A general demand to do ex-post evaluation, but this is not something that is specifically supported by EU funding. And the requirements to do environmental impact assessments and specific rules set in EU regulations about things that cannot be funded. These are all things that need to be rewritten in the set of regulations of the next MFF. So I will, how am I doing for time? I will stop there and open the floor to questions. And while we do that, please note that we need feedback on this webinar, and here you have the QR code for the feedback form. And also in the chat you will see this. So what we will see in a minute are the faces of those of you who are still with us today, and we will open up for comments.
About the ideas for dismantling the LIFE program in the next multi-annual financial framework. It would be very good if actors that are not NGOs say a good word about the LIFE program to their ministries or to the Commission. It's very good to defend the LIFE program. Because for Bulgaria, for example, if the funding for nature and biodiversity become part of the national funding, this is not good news. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that in other countries, that's also the case. Thank you.
Thank you for that point. That is, there is a lot of concern about the proposals for the LIFE program. If we have anybody from the Commission here today and they would like to speak up. I know that a lot of this is still under wraps at the moment until the Commission communication comes out, when the dialogue will really hot up. Okay, well, thank you very much. I can't see any raised hands, and I understand that we're over time. So we thank you very much for your time, for your interest in the Natura Connect and the learning materials, and please do follow the project. There will be many other stakeholder engagement events and activities going on for the next year from the project, so please do follow us. And with that, I think I close the webinar. If my colleagues would like to raise a point, please speak up now.
Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Julia, for coming to the webinar. We just want to let you know that the learning material and the finance module will be live during summer. So we will follow through with more information. But yeah, this was really a teaser, and there will be much more to come. So keep an eye out for that.
Thank you very much.